Hi, I'm Adam Summer. You're listening to the Yerushalmi Talk podcast with the support of the Yeshivat Devar Yerushalayim in Har Nof, Jerusalem. This is Terumos, chapter 2, Halacha 1 in the Art Scroll. We're on 18a1. This is part 3 of the Shir. And today we're going to be covering the law of proximity. And for Truma Gedola, it has to be within the same area to separate for this, for that. So let's say you have two piles and you want to just, make it kind of quick and separate pile A as well as the pile that you have of the same species right next to it for pile B. So rather than make two separations, you do one, but you do it for this one and that one and basically combine it together. But for the law of proximity, it says that it has to be within the same area. It has to be next to each other. Now, that's not the case for Trumas Meiser. Trumas Meiser, you can have something here in Jerusalem and something over in Sfat, as long as you have ownership of it. But over here for Truma Gedola, it has to be in the same area. And we're going to get into particulars with it. There's a lot of very cool examples on things that might not, go for proximity. For instance, what happens if you have something in the way of pile A and pile B, and it might be blocking it? Well, that's going to be an issue. So in the end of part 2, we were leaving off where the Gemara was saying that if we had two round fig cakes of pressed figs, and one is partially tamei and the other is partially tahor, each of the two cakes contain both tahor and tamei figs, and it's asking and saying, what is the law with regard to separating truma from one cake on behalf of the other? In other words, can you separate truma from the tahor figs on behalf of the other one of the tamei figs in the other cake? Now, we had it where if you have a single entity like the fig cake, and one fig is tamei and the rest is tahor, why would that be? Well, the fig juice is pressing it together, and the fig juice is not one of the 7 liquids, and so only that one is going to be tamei. And they want to say, well, you can separate this one out, the tamei one out, and separate that out as truma. That's really the only case where that's going to be a single unit, a single entity. And that's important to keep in mind for when we get to Rabbi Eliezer's example. Now, the Gemara is going to, but this case is a little bit different. This is asking what happens if you want to separate this over here for this pile on behalf of that pile. And, one is partially tamei and one is partially tahor. And again, really what this is asking is, can you do partial separations for truma? In other words, can I partially separate out from this pile and partially separate out from that pile and add it together? So the Gemara says, let the law in this case be like the law in another case where the following question is asked. It says, if in a person there was two piles of produce, one from which he separated a part of its trumos or maestros, and the other from which he separated also a part of the trumos and maestros, what is the law with regard to separating truma from one pile on behalf of the other? In other words, that on this pile, you didn't really complete the separation, but you did a little bit. And on that pile, you also did a little bit. There's more to be done. So the Gemara is, and this, by the way, is going to be coming up later on in page 32 of the Art Scroll on chapter 4, Halacha 1. And really, the case over there is talking about a case where you have a single pile of partially tithed produce, and maybe half of the amount of tithe was taken out. And the question over there is going to be, can you separate the remaining truma from this pile on behalf of the pile itself, and then maybe also another pile? And the dissent over there is by Rabbi Lazar ben Yaakov, and he's holding that somebody can never separate truma from such a pile, not even on its own behalf. In other words, once it's been partially tithed, he's saying that you can't go ahead and finish it, that it's already been rectified. And what would happen is now you're actually taking out the next set of tithes. That's what Rabbi Lazar ben Yaakov's point is. And to say, well, that's not really Truma Gedola you're taking out. You've now taken on the next set of tithes. So the Gemara is going to quote a resolution to this, I was going to say the students of Rabbi Chiya the Great posed this question to Rabbi Chiya the Great, and they responded to him saying the fool folds his hands and eats his flesh. In other words, the two piles can't be rectified, not this one on behalf of that one, certainly not the one on itself. And why would that be? Because there are 5 sets of ties. You've taken out, although not the correct amount of Truma Gedola, which is going to be by estimate, you underdid it. Now, if you're taking out ties, that's really going to be the next set. That's really Meiser Rishon you're taking out. That's not really more Truma Gedola. That's his point. So Rabbi Lazar, in the name of Rabbi Chiya the Great, says one may not separate Truma, that's going to be Truma Gedola, or Meiser from one pile on behalf of the other, where you had it where part of the pile is taken out. Now, if somebody brings species of produce in a box, and this is getting into the law of proximity, and there's cabbage on top of the box, and there's cabbage on the bottom of the box, and there's a different vegetable between these species, it says that he may not separate Truma or Meiser from one cabbage on behalf of the other. In other words, yes, the two cabbages are considered to be in the same box, and they're in proximity, but they're separated by some other vegetable, something in the way. And the Gemara is going to qualify this law. It's going to say that which you said, when does that apply? It says when there's no gap between the cabbages, and when the cabbages are separated by a different vegetable and not by empty space. But if there's a gap between the cabbages, and if the cabbages are separated only by empty space, one may separate Truma and Meiser from one cabbage on behalf of the other. Why? Because nothing is separating them. The two cabbages are considered in proximity to each other. There's nothing in the way. And the Gemara is going to quote a brisa teaching that with regard to the law of proximity, physical proximity is not the only criteria. So the Gemara teaches a novelty here. It says that the entire wine press is considered as one with regard to the law of proximity, and one may separate Truma from wine in one vat on behalf of wine in another vat. And it says another Hiddush. It says the entire threshing floor is considered as one with regard to the law of proximity, and one may separate Truma from produce in one pile on behalf of produce in another pile, even if the two piles are located at a distance from each other. In other words, there's empty space in the way, but this is on one side of the threshing floor and this is on the other side of the threshing floor. And basically what it's saying is it's in the same space. What's that space? The threshing floor. And since it's all within the same makom, the same area, it's going to, yes, okay, it's located at a distance from this, from that, and okay, that's fine, that's not in physical proximity, but it's held together by the same location. In other words, this same threshing floor draws them close. And by the way, a threshing floor is going to be a flat area where they thresh grain and they stack it into piles and they winnow it. And regarding the vat, each vat might be a separate enclosure, and their contents, by the way, are going to be, the wine is going to be in separate vats, not going to be, in separate, but they're not in physical proximity. But the fact that they're located in the same wine press is what's going to draw them close. And the Gemara is going to continue, and it's going to say that not only a functional threshing floor can draw the distant piles closer, but the brisa taught further, said Rabbi Yudah said that this law is applicable only when the contents of the threshing floor are still lying in the middle of the threshing floor. And only then is the threshing floor considered functional. But if, however, the kernels of wheat were stacked and straw and stubble were cleared away, the threshing floor is no longer considered functional and no longer can draw the distant piles closer. So there's a question on Rabbi Yudah's statement about that this has to still be in use in order to pull them together. In other words, it has to be still considered functional. So the question goes like this. It says, so far we understood that as long as the wheat remains lying on the threshing floor is considered functional. So the question is the threshing floor still considered functional even if the wheat has been stacked and all that remains lying on the threshing floor is going to be just straw or stubble? And the Gemara doesn't resolve that. So the Mara Fulda is going to say that the Gemara does resolve this question, perhaps, by ruling that the threshing floor is considered functional, even if only straw or stubble remains lying in it. And the Gemara is going to ask another question about this follow-up. Rabbi Chagai asks in the presence of Rabbi Yossi, says, what if there's a pile of tamei grain laying in the middle of the threshing floor? And it's basically implying this. It's saying, are the surrounding piles of tahor grain considered to be in proximity or not? In other words, let's say you have 3 piles of grain. One is tahor, one is in the middle, the one that's tahor is on the edge, and one is on the opposite edge. It's also tahor, but there's a tamei one in the middle. And so you have 3. And the question is this one that's tamei in the middle going to be like something interposing in that box of cabbage? In other words, if I have cabbage and then carrots and then cabbage, is this tamei pile of grain just going to be like the carrots, where it's going to prevent me tithing this cabbage on behalf of that cabbage, even though it's in the same box? So Rabbi Yossi is going to answer and say back to Rabbi Chagai, it says, can this be considered as if the tahor piles are biting each other? In other words, under these circumstances, can a tahor pile be considered in proximity? No. Why? Because it's as if this is another species. In other words, the tamei product is as if it's completely something else, like carrots. And so there's no proximity. And when we're talking about biting, we're talking about Masechet Challah, where this dough will bite to that dough. And in other words, the tamei pile in the middle of the threshing floor is viewed as an intervening foreign species, and therefore it's going to prevent the law of proximity. And there's another question. The scholars of the academy asked in the presence of Rabbi Yossi, it says, what is the law if there was a curtain in the middle of the threshing floor? In other words, we put up a curtain there between pile A and pile B, and this curtain's in the middle. In other words, are the piles going to be considered in proximity or not? And the Gemara answers. Rabbi Yossi says to them that this case is similar to the case of 5 sacks of grain in the threshing floor, and was taught in Brisa that the law regarding 5 sacks of grain in the threshing floor is as follows, that we may separate truma and meiser from one sack on behalf of the other. So although the grain is in a separate sack, the threshing floor still draws them close, and so too, even though the pile of grain is separated by a curtain, the threshing floor still draws them close, and one may separate truma from one pile on behalf of the other. The way I'm thinking about this now is, let's say you're at a bris and you're in a room, and let's say you have a mechitza up. Well, certainly the room and the occasion is drawing everybody together, and while the women may be on one side of the mechitza and the men are on the other side of the mechitza, still everybody's at the same bris. And I think of it like that. Now, we're going to get into the next part that's very interesting. It's Rabbi Eliezer from the Mishnah, who said that one may separate from produce that is tahor on behalf of produce that is tamei. And everybody's going to understand that this is talking about wet or liquids or wet produce. What's going to be a case of wet produce? Let's say you have olives pickled in vinegar. Or another case of wet produce, what about challah? In other words, you mix flour together with water. That now is going to be considered wet produce. Can makabel tuma, and the olives can makabel tuma. And over in the case of dry produce, let's say you have a stack of grain and it never became wet. Well, those are just individual kernels of grain. So Rabbi Eliezer is saying that you can separate tahor produce on behalf of tamei produce, but it's only going to be with this case of the wet produce. And the Mishnah is going to state that, according to Rabbi Eliezer, one may separate truma from tahor produce on produce that's tamei. And again, it's only in this case. But Rabbi Eliezer is going to be giving a way to do it. And by the way, this is also going to be connecting to his opinion in Masechet Challah. So women today will take a basket and they'll put their challah together. And according to Rabbi Eliezer, that if you're going to be making, dough 1 and dough 2 and combining the two together so that you have the required amount to do the tithing, that you have to connect it, physically connect it. And also, when you're going to be tithing this one from that one, he's also going to be demanding that you're going to make a connector. Now, Rabbi Eliezer is going to be saying that the sages did not require this connector for dry product because either it would be too difficult to make this connector work for like individual grains, or what would happen is people would have a hard time doing it, and then they would just not do it altogether. Now, we covered this in part one of this year on tithing tahor for tamei, and there's a maloket here. Certainly, it seems also in the Amorim and the Tanaim and in the Rishonim, whether this requirement is going to be d'oraita or d'Rabbanan. This comes up again. There's going to be two ways to explain it. One way to explain this is going to be where Rabbi Eliezer is going to be saying that this is a d'Rabbanan example, and the other way is going to be saying it where, as if Rabbi Eliezer is saying it's a d'oraita example, prohibition, except that this is the one waiver where it applies. And Rabbi Eliezer in both cases is going to be giving you the one way to do it. But, again, this comes up also in the Rosh and the Rambam. The Rosh is going to be saying that this tithing, tamei for tahor for tamei is d'Rabbanan, and the Rambam is going to be saying, no, it's actually a d'oraita that you can't do it. Everybody agrees you can't do it. But this one waiver is going to be in the case of liquids or wet produce. So it was taught in this brisa that Rabbi Eli says in the name of Rabbi Eliezer that one may separate truma from tahor produce on behalf of tamei produce in the case of liquids or moist produce. And we're going to be getting into this. In other words, that although the Mishnah does not specifically differentiate the different types of product, Rabbi Eli, they had a common understanding that Rabbi Eliezer's opinion applied only to liquids. And Rabbi Eli's interpretation of the term liquid is coming to also refer to moist produce. This is a commentary by Rabbi Kanievsky. And so he's explaining that with regards to dry produce, Rabbi Eliezer agrees with the Tanakama that one may not separate truma from tahor produce on behalf of tamei produce, and Rabbi Lazar or Eliezer is accepting that there's a rabbinic decree forbidding this type of separation, and he's maintaining that the decree was promulgated only for dry produce, but not for moist produce. Now, the reason for the distinction between moist and dry is like this, that the one way somebody fulfills the law of proximity without contaminating the truma is by setting up this bridge to indirectly connect the truma with the tamei produce. And in that case of the moist produce, a person is confident that he can connect them like this. Now imagine like you have dough A and dough B, and you take some of the dough A and you make a bridge to connect to dough B. So, you can see it's not that hard to do it. And in the case that we're going to be doing, like if you had olives, you're going to be taking like a pipe, and it's going to be less than the size of a beaks. I'll explain why that is. And, some of the olives can move around, some of the liquid can move around, but you can tie this for that. Now, if you have the case where this is tamei and this is tahor, well, you're worried about contaminating all of the other stuff. And in the case of building the bridge, what happens is you're going to indirectly connect it in a way where only the food item that's touching it is going to become tamei. So the rule is that anything under the size of an egg for food can become tamei, but food that's the size of an egg or bigger is only what can contaminate other food. So food that's the size of an egg or smaller can't contaminate other food. It can become tamei, but when it touches something else, it can't make what it touches tamei. So the idea when you're building this bridge is to keep the size of the bridge where it's less than the size of a beitza, or kazait, I mean. And then what happens is that, okay, fine, you contaminated this one little piece, so like some olives got to become tamei from touching, the vat of tamei olives and with vinegar, and these ones over here, and you connect the bridge, but only these olives became contaminated. You didn't contaminate all of the olives from this vat into that vat. Now, if the connector was going to be bigger than the kazait, then what would happen is then you can contaminate everything from this vat into that vat. And the sages Rabbi Eliezer is saying that the sages put this up only for wet or moist things because it's easy to do for that. In other words, you're taking a piece of dough and you're making a little connector from this piece to that piece. It's easy to do for the law of proximity. But if you could imagine you had temeh grain and tahor grain, and now you have to make a connector, it's going to spill all over the place, and you're going to mix it up, and it's going to be hard to do, and then people aren't going to do it. So that's why Rabbi Eliezer is going to be saying that that this is the way to do it. So and this is the structure of how to do it. So the Gemara is going to explain how so. And it's going to say if he submerged olives in vinegar that were in a state of tuma, and he wishes to separate truma on their behalf from olives that are in a state of tahara, he brings a funnel whose mouth is not as large as an egg. Sorry, I didn't mean a kazait, I meant a beitza. And he fills the funnel with tahor olives, and he places it on the mouth of the barrel. So basically, the olives at the mouth of the barrel are going to be this bridge between the tahor olives at the top and the tamei olives inside the barrel. And it's going to allow you to make a separation on behalf of this for that. Why? Because now because it's connected as a bridge, you have the law of proximity, and it's considered like one thing. That's the idea, is that you've connected these two things together. So it emerges, says the Gemara, that he separates truma from that which is in proximity to the tamei olives without contaminating the truma. So the only thing that, because the rule of the beitza, the only thing that can become contaminated is the individual olive, okay? But if it's smaller than the beitza, then the olives from the tamei area can't contaminate the tahor area. All that happens is that you can make the olives right in the bridge become contaminated. But they themselves are in something that's too small to contaminate everything else. And so each individual olive is going to be smaller than a beitza, and because it's not significant enough, because each individual olive is smaller than a beitza, it can't contaminate the other product. It can be contaminated, but it can't make the other stuff tamei. So you just have to find a vessel, and it has to be where it's going to create this bridge, and you're going to keep the tamei produce and the truma on opposite sides of it. Now, the problem with the dry produce would be that when somebody is going to handle it, the person's going to be worried that if he's making a bridge, the truma is going to fall into the tamei produce, and it's going to get all intermingled. And so the rabbis, says Rabbi Kanievsky, if you're going to be reading it where it's to Rabbanan, were concerned that he would attempt to connect them with a bridge, and then he would get flustered, and he'd decide like it's too complicated, things are spilling all over the place, and instead he would decide not to do it, and then what would happen is he's going to violate the law of proximity. Now, the other way to read this is going to be where Rabbi Eliezer is going to be saying that this is a d'oraita obligation to separate tahor for tamei, and that the only case that you can do it is going to be where it's with liquids. And the way to read that, with the other way to put it together, like what the Rambam would suggest, by the way, would be that Rabbi Eliezer does not agree with the decree of the Tanna Kama, and the reading would be that Rabbi Eliezer's holding, according to how Rabbi Lai is explaining it, that where the law of proximity requires actual physical contact, the dry produce doesn't do that. Only moist produce will actually connect when it comes into contact, and that is going to be considered where this and that are connected. So one can't separate truma from tahor dry produce on behalf of tamei dry produce because there's no way to fulfill the proximity requirement in that case. Even if you're putting them together, and even if you're using a bridge, they're still not really connected. But with the moist produce, Rabbi Eliezer is saying that they are. So this way to look at it is where Rabbi Lazar is limiting and having a permissive ruling that moist products are going to have a different way to do it, because the nature of a moist or wet product is a little bit different than a dry product like grain. So the Gemara is going to continue. It's going to say, why do I need the opening to be less than the size of an egg? Even if it's the size of an egg, are the olives in the mouth not separated from this side from that side? So why does it have to be where each olive at the mouth of the funnel is less than the size of the egg, and the olive, will still, remain tahor. And the Gemara answers, Rabbi Lazar specified the mouth be smaller than an egg in order to not render many olives tameh. In other words, that what's happening is that although it would still be possible to separate truma tahara for the tameh olives in the opening of the funnel, if they were larger, then Rabbi Lazar is stating that one should not use a funnel that's going to be bigger because all the olives in the mouth will become tameh. Rather, one should use a funnel where the opening contains less than the volume of an egg, and that's in order to minimize the number of olives becoming tameh. And although in this case it's necessary to cause some of the olives in contact to become tameh, it minimizes the number. So the Gemara is going to answer, and Rabbi Lai is going to specify that the mouth be smaller than the egg in order to not render many olives tameh. And the Gemara looks back at this brisa, which reports a response, and they say back to the rabbis say back to Rabbi Lai. They said that there is nothing that is called liquid other than wine or oil. In other words, Rabbi Lazar's permissive ruling applies only to these substances, which are actual liquids and not moist product. So this, by the way, is also going to come up as a question in the second Hala, because Rabbi Eliezer is going to be requiring this bridge for law of proximity. So over there. So the Gemara is going to wonder, how is this done? How can you separate truma that's tahor on behalf of wine or oil that's tameh and still fulfill the law of requirement proximity without contaminating all of the truma? And the Gemara is going to concede that in ordinary cases, truma that's tahor may not be separated for wine or oil that's tameh, because in these cases the law of proximity can't be done. And the sages were stating that Rabbi Eliezer permits this act. It's also just talking about specific cases. In other words, if you made a bridge between this barrel and this barrel is tameh and this barrel is tahor, yes, it's one entity now, but the problem is because it's a liquid, barrel A now contaminates barrel B, and they become intermingled, and they're both tameh now. So the way that he was doing it with the bridge for the olives was that only a few olives become tameh, not the whole barrel. And they're still connected, and so that's how you can do it. I think it's a very clever way, but again, it's only going to be specific cases. And the Gemara is going to look more about this, and it's going to say that if there was one beam for two cisterns, truma may be separated from the oil in one cistern on behalf of the oil in the other, and this applies even if the oil in the first is tahor and the second is tameh. And similarly, if there's two beams for one cistern, truma could be separated from the oil that was pressed by this beam on behalf of that beam. So basically what this is saying is that the cistern combines all the oil into a batch, and because all the oil is considered to be in proximity to each other, even though some of it's tameh and some of it's tahor, the law of proximity is being fulfilled simply by having been pressed by the same beam and not necessarily being in contact with each other in the same vat. But in other words, the work is being done in the same area. And that's going to be a lot like the wine vat. So the Gemara is going to look at the second case, and it's going to say it's well if the case of one beam for two cisterns. And, is it possible for one cistern to be tahor and one to be tameh? But in the case of two beams for one cistern, how would that work? And it seems to be problematic, says the Gemara. So it says that since all of the oil is in the same cistern, once some of it becomes tameh, all of it becomes tameh. So how can you say that, there's any tahor oil in there at all? The Gemara answers, Rabbi La says in the name of Rabbi Eliezer, regarding this problem of if you had one cistern, one pressing area, but you had two beams doing it, one beam was tameh and one beam was tahor. Now, basically the whole area, the whole vat now has tameh oil. So he's going to say, interpret it as referring to where his original intent was to make one batch in a single cistern, and he changed his mind and decided to make two batches. In other words, that one of the cisterns became tameh since he originally planned to combine the two pools of oil, and he can separate truma from one pool on behalf of the other, and it's only going to be where they're going to be in two different cisterns. So the Gemara is going to state further that this principle applies also in the case of wine. Rabbi Yosef, son of Rabbi Bun, says that which you say that the truma can be taken from wine in the tahor cistern on behalf of wine in the tamei cistern applies only when it became tamei after he removed the seeds, the skins from the grapes from the wine, and then it was at one time fit to have truma separated from them in a state of tahara. But if it became tamei before he removed the seeds and the skins from the wine, the ruling does not apply to this case. Why? Because the wine in the tamei cistern was never fit to have truma that's tahor separated it. Why? Because it's not considered one batch, and the wine in the tahor cistern cannot be separated from truma in the latter cistern on the other's behalf. In other words, it has to be like you're making a single batch, whether it's going to be the oil or the wine, and if you have some sort of hefsek or break where now it's not considered like you're making one batch, even though you're separating them out of the vats, but it's like one continuous making or process. That's going to be the idea. And this comes up a lot in the Gemara. What is going to be considered a making? So if you're making like tzitzis, and how do you make tzitzis, right? That goes back to the maloka between Shmuel and Rav, that you prepare, you tie all the knots, but you didn't separate the strings, right? Rav says that they're tzitzis once you separate the strings. Shmuel says no, you have to tie the knots first. You have to cut it first, and then tie the knots, and then that's going to be considered the making. And like over here, it's going to be the vat of wine. That's very nice that you're going to make 2 vats of wine. You're going to take one out and then the other out. And as long as there's no break and you're continuing to work, and if one became tamei and one became tahor, it's held together in the law of proximity between this and that because it's all considered like one making. And so because of that, that's how it could be held together with the law of proximity, even though you have some in this vat, some in that vat now, because it's all being done together. Have a great day.